I took care of my grandmother alone for 15 years. What I found in the envelope changed my life. Caleb was 32 years old and had a life that fit inside a small apartment. It wasn't a complaint, just a statement of fact. And in that apartment, on a sofa pushed against the living room wall, his grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor, slept with her white hair spread across the pillow, her breathing calm, her hands folded over her chest, just as she always did when resting. He had been holding the envelope for almost 2 minutes without being able to open it. He had found it inside the little wooden box that sat in the drawer of her dresser, that light-colored dresser with round knobs on the drawers, which had been in her room since before he was born. The dresser smelled of lavender and of thyme. He knew every detail of that piece of furniture because for years he was the one who cleaned it, who organized it, who opened those drawers when she could no longer bend down easily. The envelope was brown craft paper, slightly yellowed at the edges, and his name was written on the front in handwriting, in that neat, careful, round script Mrs. Eleanor still used when she was doing well. Caleb. Just that. No last name. As if she knew he would understand. He didn't know if he should open it. For 15 years he had done everything for her. 15 years. Ever since he was 17 and the other family members had disappeared one by one, each with a new excuse, each with a life that, according to them, couldn't be reconciled with caring for an elderly woman who needed more and more attention. 15 years in which Caleb woke up early to give her medicine on time, in which he learned to cook the way she liked, in which he cancelled plans, gave things up, built a life around her life. And now here was an envelope with his name written in her hand, hidden in a drawer she had never asked him to open. Caleb took a deep breath and pulled out the sheet of paper inside. But to understand what was in that letter, you need to understand what came before, because this story doesn't begin that afternoon. It begins much further back, in a time when Caleb still wore a backpack on his shoulders and thought family was something solid, something that didn't crack. He was 17 when his mother left. It didn't happen overnight. It was a process he can now see more clearly, but at the time it seemed simply incomprehensible. His mother, Brenda, was Mrs. Eleanor's youngest daughter. She was a woman with an easy laugh and difficult problems she never knew how to carry properly. Caleb never knew his father, who had left the scene years before without leaving an address. And Brenda gradually pulled away, first with visits that grew shorter, then with phone calls that grew rarer, until one winter morning she showed up with a big bag, gave him a quick hug, said she needed to take care of some things and would be back soon. She didn't come back soon. Mrs. Eleanor was the one who was there, always. Ever since Caleb was a child and his mother needed to work or go out or disappear for a few days. It was his grandmother who warmed the milk, who checked his homework, who stayed awake waiting when he came home late. She was 62 at the time, still agile, her hair darker with a few streaks of white, her voice steady. And when Brenda left for good, it was Mrs. Eleanor who looked at her grandson and said, with that calm she had of making anything serious seem manageable, "Then you'll stay with me, we'll manage." And they managed. Caleb finished high school taking care of the house while she could still work as a seamstress. Then she had to stop because of the pain in her hands, and he found a job as a delivery driver, then at a grocery store. Then he learned to do maintenance work, electronics repair, anything that paid the bills. In his early 20s, he had already developed a skill with computers and was building up remote work, slowly stumbling quite a bit, but never stopping. It was enough to pay the rent, the food, and her medications, which kept increasing as the years went by. The aunts and uncles showed up every now and then. Aunt Susan, Mrs. Eleanor's middle daughter, lived in a town a few hours away. She called on her mother's birthday, sometimes at Easter. When Caleb asked for help, she always had a very logical reason not to be able to. Her husband was sick, the house renovation, work was demanding, her daughters needed her. There was always something preventing her from showing up, but there was never anything preventing her from giving her opinion on whether Caleb was or wasn't taking care of Mrs. Eleanor. Once, Susan called saying she had heard that her mother had gone 2 days without taking a medication because the pharmacy had run out. Caleb had gone to get the medication the next day, first thing in the morning, and had already taken care of it. But Susan talked as if he were negligent, with that tone of someone who knows a lot without needing to see anything up close. He swallowed it. He learned to swallow a lot of things. Cousin Derek was the son of one of Mrs. Eleanor's brothers, who had passed away, so he was a more distant relative, but he showed up at family gatherings as if he were close. Derek had a way of showing up in good times and disappearing in difficult ones that was almost impressive. When Mrs. Eleanor went through a more serious health period, about 3 years ago, Caleb called everyone asking if someone could stay with her for a few days while he tried to resolve an urgent work situation. Derek said he'd try, that he'd see, that he'd call back. He never called. It was the neighbor, Gail, who stayed. Gail was 58 years old, a widow, and had been living in the apartment next door for about 12 years. She and Mrs. Eleanor had become friends in that way that only happens between people who live wall to wall for long enough. Gail knew where the spare key was, knew the medication routine, knew the right way to help Mrs. Eleanor sit up when she woke up dizzy. She did this without asking for anything in return, just because she liked the two of them. Caleb never quite knew how to thank her for that. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The two of them had a routine that was, at the same time, heavy and comforting. Caleb woke up before her, prepared the coffee with cream she liked very hot, set out the morning pills in the little blue plastic cup that stayed next to the sink. She woke up slowly, with that expression of someone coming back from a very deep place, looked at him and smiled, before even saying good morning. It was a smile that Caleb couldn't quite explain, but that was worth so much. It was worth more than anything else that happened the rest of the day. They talked a lot, about everything, and about almost nothing. She liked to tell stories from the past, from when she was young, about the neighborhood where she grew up, about the husband she had lost too soon. Caleb listened with genuine attention because her stories had a quality he couldn't find anywhere else, a depth of life, an honesty about how much things could be at the same time, beautiful and painful. But there were subjects she would dodge, not in a rude way, not in a way that was obvious at first glance. It was a subtle art. Whenever Brenda's name came up in the conversation, Mrs. Eleanor would get quiet for a second, choose her words with a different kind of care, slightly change the course of the sentence. Caleb had noticed it long ago, but had learned not to push. He had come to terms with the idea that some subjects needed to stay where they were. Until the day of the appointment, Mrs. Eleanor had gone to the doctor for a routine checkup. Nothing urgent, nothing that had set off any alarm, just the semi-annual follow-up with the cardiologist she'd been seeing for years. Caleb went with her, as always. He sat in the chair beside her while the doctor patiently talked about the tests, about her heart that had been through so much, but was, within what was expected, doing fine. On the way back, she was too quiet. Caleb asked if everything was okay. She said yes, she was just tired. But it was a different kind of tired from the one he knew. It was the tiredness of someone thinking about something heavy. When they got home, she went to lie down earlier than usual. Caleb stayed in the living room trying to work, but with that strange feeling that something was different in the air without being able to identify what. That's when she called out, "Caleb." Her voice came from the bedroom. It wasn't urgency. It wasn't fright. It was just a call. He went to the door. "I need you to get my notebook. It's in the bottom drawer of the dresser. There's some health insurance paperwork the doctor asked me to bring next time." He opened the drawer. And there was the envelope. It was under the notebook, under a stack of folded papers that were indeed health insurance documents. It wasn't hidden in an obvious way, but it was protected, buried underneath other things. And it had his name on the front, written in blue ink in that handwriting he'd recognize anywhere. He stood still. He looked toward the bedroom, but she had already closed her eyes. She had gone quiet fast, as happened sometimes, her body giving in before she even planned to fall asleep. Caleb picked up the envelope carefully, took it to the living room, sat in the armchair by the window, and stared at it for a long time. Here I need to pause for a second. Because, imagining that moment, a 32-year-old guy who had given everything he had for 15 years holding an envelope with his name written by the hand of the only person who had never disappeared from his life. It's a specific weight. It's a kind of weight that isn't sadness and isn't joy. It's anticipation of everything that might be about to change. I don't know about you all, but that moment caught me in a way I didn't expect. Caleb opened the envelope slowly. There was more than one thing inside. The first was a sheet of paper folded in three, written on both sides in Mrs. Eleanor's handwriting. It began like this: "My Caleb, if you're reading this, it's because I decided it was time. I don't know if I'll have the courage to give it to you in person. Maybe I can only manage to let you find it." He had to stop at the second line to breathe. The letter said she had been thinking about it for a long time, that day's appointment hadn't brought bad news, but it had brought something more subtle, the renewed certainty that she wasn't young, that time really did pass, and that there were things she couldn't keep carrying alone. And then she began to tell him. She told him about a savings account she had opened when Caleb was 18, an account in his name, funded every month with a little, sometimes very little, sometimes with whatever was left over from extra money she got from odd sewing jobs, from a neighbor's kindness, from any penny she could set aside without him noticing. All those years, every month, she had deposited something. Sometimes it was much less than she wanted, but she had never let a month go by without putting something in. Caleb stared at that part of the letter for a length of time he couldn't measure. 15 years. Her saving in secret, every month, while he thought they were always at the limit, always scrambling to make ends meet. She had built something there, slowly, in silence, without saying a word. Inside the envelope, there was also a more formal sheet of paper with account details and a branch number, and an amount. Caleb read the number more than once because he wasn't sure he was reading it right. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't going to solve everything at once or radically change the material reality of his life overnight. But it was real. It was concrete. It was more than he had imagined existed, accumulated drop by drop by a woman in her 70s who had never stopped thinking about him, even on the days when she herself was struggling. But the letter wasn't over, and it was what came next that made Caleb need to sink even deeper into the armchair, as if his legs had lost their certainty. Mrs. Eleanor wrote, her handwriting a little slower now, as if every word had cost her more. "There's something else I need to tell you, something I went back and forth about for a long time, wondering whether it was my place to tell you or not. But I know that if I leave without telling you, it would be an injustice. You deserve to know." Inside the envelope there was a second sheet. This one was different. It was an older letter, the paper a deeper shade of yellow, the handwriting different from Mrs. Eleanor's, a handwriting slanted to the right, with the A's formed in a specific way. It was Brenda's handwriting. Caleb's mother had written that letter, and it was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor. He began to read. The letter had no exact date, but from the references Brenda made, Caleb figured it had been written about 8 years earlier. 8 years after she had left, when he was 24. Brenda wrote that she was doing well, that she was in a coastal city where she had found steady work, that she was trying to rebuild herself after many very difficult years. And then she wrote something he had never imagined, that every month she sent money to Mrs. Eleanor. It wasn't much, but it was every month. And she asked her mother to use that money for Caleb somehow, without necessarily telling him where it came from, because she knew her son probably didn't want to hear from her, not after everything. Caleb had to stop. He looked to the side. There was Mrs. Eleanor sleeping on the couch with that usual peace, her white hair, her hands folded, all that money in the savings account. Part of what his grandmother had set aside every month also came from what Brenda sent. His grandmother had mixed it all together, had saved it all, had built that reserve from both parts without telling anyone. But that wasn't all. Brenda's letter went on, and what she said in the final part was what truly knocked the ground out from under Caleb. She wrote that Caleb's father hadn't simply disappeared out of irresponsibility. She wrote that there was an old feud, a quarrel that involved the whole family, one that she had fed with jealousy and grievance upon grievance, and that she had done things that left him without access to his son. She didn't go into every detail, but she said it clearly. I was wrong. I was wrong more than you know, Mom. And Caleb paid for it. She said Caleb's father was named Raymond, that he was from a town in the interior, that she had the address, if Caleb ever wanted to know. Caleb placed the sheets on his lap and stared out the window. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward its end, that yellow light that turns orange before fading away. Out on the street, people coming home from work, a child running along a stretch of sidewalk, a dog barking somewhere farther off. The world kept going just the same. But inside that small apartment, something had changed in size. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Caleb sat there for a long time without doing anything. Then he heard Mrs. Eleanor stirring on the sofa, that rustling of someone waking up, that moment of confusion she sometimes had between sleep and waking. Caleb? He went over to her with the envelope in his hand. She opened her eyes slowly, and when she saw what he was holding, she showed no surprise. She was quiet for a moment, with that look of someone who had finally reached the point of a conversation she had been putting off for a long time. You found it, she said. It wasn't a question. I found it. She made a very slight gesture with her head, as if confirming was enough. Did you read everything? Everything. The silence between them lasted a few seconds. Then she patted the place next to her on the sofa, that simple gesture that was an invitation, and he went and sat down. I should have told you before, she said. Why didn't you tell me? She thought for a moment before answering. It was the kind of pause he knew well in her, that pause in which she was organizing not the words, but the honesty with which she was going to say them. For two reasons. The first is that I didn't know if Brenda was going to keep sending them or stop from one moment to the next, and I didn't want to create an expectation that would vanish. You had already suffered enough with her disappearing acts. Caleb listened without interrupting, and the second reason, she continued more slowly, is that I wasn't sure if it was my place to decide when you would find out about your father. Your mother sent me that letter, but she never gave me permission to pass it on to you. I carried that in my head for a long time. You know I'm not one to decide things that big on my own. But you decided to keep it, he said. Not as an accusation, but as an observation. I decided to keep it until I thought you would be ready, or until I thought I couldn't wait any longer. She paused. I think today was both at the same time. Caleb looked at her. That woman with completely white hair, a face full of lines that were years, that were choices, that were things carried and things let go. He had lived with her for 32 years, knew every habit, every tone of voice, every silence, and still she had kept things he didn't know, not out of malice, out of a very specific kind of love, that love that tries to protect even when protection is no longer what the person needs. The savings account, he said after a moment. I had no idea. She gave that brief smile, barely opening her mouth, which he knew as the smile she had when she was satisfied with something she had done. I know you didn't. Why didn't you let me help? You could have told me you were saving. I could have contributed too. Because you already contributed everything else, she said. You paid for everything, took care of everything, never complained. I needed to have something that was just mine to do for you, do you understand? It was the only thing I could still do. Caleb kept looking ahead for a moment. There are things we hear and feel like we know that pain from somewhere, that silent pride of someone who can't do much but does what they can, with all the dignity in the world. I felt that part. And about Raymond, he said. The name came out different, a little strange in his mouth, like a word in another language he was still learning to pronounce. About Raymond, she repeated just as slowly. You have no obligation to look for him. No obligation at all. I know. And if you want to look for him, you also don't have to be afraid of what you'll find. Do you think he knows I exist? She took longer to answer this time. Brenda wrote that yes, that he knows, but that he spent years without a way to reach you because of what happened between the two of them. Caleb sat there processing it all in silence. A father who knew he existed, a father who was in some inland city, Lincoln, with a name and an address kept in a yellowed letter in a brown craft envelope. His whole life he had built an idea of abandonment, of absence without explanation. And now that idea was cracked, not destroyed, not replaced by something simple, but truly cracked with light coming through the cracks. In the days that followed, Caleb walked around carrying that envelope inside himself. Not literally, but it's the only way to describe what happens when a revelation like that settles in. It stays there, taking up space, demanding attention, until the person decides what to do with it. He talked to Gail. It was hard not to, because she was one of those people who noticed when something was different before you even knew how to put it into words. Gail sat at their kitchen table and listened to all of it, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, without interrupting once. "So?" she asked when he finished. "I don't know yet. It makes sense not to know yet. Do you think I should reach out to him?" She thought for a moment, with the kind of honesty that had to be the thing Caleb loved most about her. "I think you'll know when it's time. And I think the fact that you're asking that question means some part of you already wants to." As for Aunt Susan, she called that very same week, whether by coincidence or fate, asking how his mother was, in that tone of someone who asks more out of habit than out of any real need to know. Caleb said she was fine, and stayed silent about the rest. It wasn't the time, and maybe it wasn't the place. Mrs. Eleanor, in the days after the conversation, was lighter. It was visible, as if she had carried that envelope not only in a drawer but inside her body, and now that it had passed into the right hands, an old tension had finally eased. One morning, while they were having coffee, she said out of nowhere, without the subject having come up, "You were the best thing that ever happened in my life, you know." He looked at her. "Grandma, I'm not being sappy. I'm being honest. You could have left. When your mother left, you could have found a way to disappear too. You had every reason in the world to do it, but you stayed. I can't see myself anywhere else. I know, but you could have seen yourself. That's a choice, Caleb, and I know what it cost." He kept looking at his cup. "It didn't cost me the way people think," he said. And it was true, a truth he had taken a long time to understand, but it was there. There were hard days. There were nights when I was angry at everyone, at the aunts and uncles who disappeared, at my mother, at not knowing who my father was. But when I came too close to thinking it had all been a waste, then I'd look at you, and it didn't seem like a waste at all." Mrs. Eleanor said nothing. Her eyes grew a little damp, in that way she had of showing emotion without making a fuss. And that was that. It took Caleb just over a month to write the first message. He had found the man on social media using the information from the letter, a process that took a few weeks of careful searching, of hesitation, of stepping back and moving forward again. Raymond was 60-something now, worked in a small shop, had a face that Caleb stared at for several minutes, looking for something familiar in his features. The message was short. It only said who he was, how he had gotten there, and that he had no expectations, just a question that had been hanging for a long time. The reply came the same day. It wasn't a short reply. Raymond wrote like someone who had rehearsed that moment many times in his head, and still wasn't truly prepared. He said he knew any explanation came too late, that he had no intention of rewriting the past or occupying a place he hadn't earned, but that if Caleb wanted to talk, in any way, at any pace, he would be there. Caleb read the message several times. Then he took his phone to the living room and showed it to Mrs. Eleanor. She read slowly, glasses at the tip of her nose, moving her lips a little the way she did with texts she wanted to fully absorb. When he finished, he lowered his phone and stared ahead for a moment. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think he looks scared." "Yeah." "Scared isn't bad. Scared means it matters to him." Caleb put his phone in his pocket. He didn't have an answer yet, but he knew one would come. In the months that followed, he and Raymond were building something that didn't have an exact name, that wasn't friendship, that wasn't yet the big thing it might one day become, but that also wasn't nothing. It was contact. It was the careful presence of two people who shared a piece of history and were figuring out what to do with it now that they recognized each other. Aunt Susan found out about the savings account at some point, not through the details, just that it existed. She called with a surprise that carried a hint of resentment inside it, the kind of reaction from someone who had hoped there'd be nothing to divide and was bothered to discover there was. But Mrs. Eleanor was very clear that was Caleb's. She had built it for Caleb. There was nothing to discuss. Susan went quiet. Gail, when she found out about everything, stood in the doorway of their apartment for a good while listening to Caleb tell the story, and when he finished, she let out a short laugh of astonishment and shook her head. "Your grandmother is the most organized person I've ever met in my life," she said. And Caleb truly laughed for the first time in a long while. Mrs. Eleanor gradually learned about the conversations between Caleb and Raymond. She never asked for details, never pushed. But every now and then she'd ask a discreet question, the kind like, "So, did you talk to him this week?" And when Caleb said yes, she'd give that short smile, the same one she had when she was satisfied with something she'd done. One Saturday morning, Raymond showed up. It hadn't been planned far in advance. It had been arranged a few days earlier with some hesitation on both sides. But he showed up. He knocked on the door, stood in the hallway with the look of someone who doesn't quite know where to put his hands. Grey hair, around 60-something years on his face, a small package under his arm that he said, awkwardly, was some muffins from a bakery he'd found on the way. Caleb stared at him for a second before opening the door wider. "Come in." Mrs. Eleanor was in the kitchen when Raymond came in. She walked out slowly, her glasses on her head. The apron she still liked to wear, even though she didn't cook as much anymore. The two of them looked at each other for a moment, long enough to be heavy with everything. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor," he said. "Good afternoon," she replied. She looked at him in a direct way, that look of someone who assesses and decides quickly. Then she said, with all the simplicity in the world, "Want some coffee?" And he said he did. They stayed in the kitchen for almost 2 hours. They talked about small things at first, about the neighborhood, about the weather, about the muffins that were good indeed. Then things gradually got bigger, the way they do when people genuinely want to get somewhere, but respect that it's a long road. It wasn't a morning that fixed everything. It wasn't the kind of meeting that erases the years or suddenly turns pain into nothing, but it was real. It was honest. And when Raymond left in the early afternoon, and Caleb closed the door and came back to the kitchen, Mrs. Eleanor was washing the cups with her back to him. He walked over to her and stood behind her without saying anything for a moment. "Grandma." "Thank you." She turned off the faucet and turned around. She looked at him with those eyes that had known everything about him since before he had memories. "What is it?" she said, pretending she didn't understand. "For the envelope." "For everything." She waved her hand, that way of someone brushing off formality, but her eyes gave away what she was feeling. "Go on and wash those cups, I'm already tired." And Caleb washed, laughing softly, right there beside her, in the small kitchen of the apartment that was their whole life together. The end. Sometimes we spend years thinking we know exactly the extent of our own story. You know where you came from, you know what you lost, you know what you built. And then an envelope shows up in a drawer and the story becomes bigger than you imagined. Not necessarily easier, but bigger, more complete, truer. Caleb didn't get a perfect family in the end. He got something more honest than that. The chance to choose what to do with what had been kept hidden. And he chose to stay present, just as he always had. Tell us what you thought of this story. Where do you think Caleb and Raymond will go from here? And you? Have you ever received a revelation that changed what you thought you knew about someone you loved? Leave it in the comments, I read them all. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories worth hearing.